Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we gather by the fire to uncover a story hidden deep beneath the marble and grandeur of ancient Rome. A story not of emperors or epic battles, but of shadows, secrets, and silent power. Outside, the night is still. A soft glow flickers from the fireplace, casting gentle golden halos across the room. Perhaps you're curled beneath a blanket or resting with your eyes already half closed. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Take a slow breath in and let it out. All across the world, others are doing the same, listening to the crackle of flame and drifting into another time. If you haven't yet, feel free to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always nice to know who's drifting off beside the fire. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some gentle white noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. Beneath the cobbled streets of Rome, below the noise of sandals and senators, there were tunnels. Miles of them, winding like roots beneath the city's foundation. Some were old aqueducts or burial corridors, others newly dug by hands not sanctioned by the empire. These are not places on any map, and those who entered them rarely spoke of it above ground. It is the 1st century CE. Emperor Domitian sits on the throne, a man obsessed with order, silence, and the appearance of control. Above, the Colosseum nears completion, its towering bones of stone rising like a god's amphitheater. But down below, in the Undercity, another kind of empire stirs, quieter, older, and in many ways more enduring. In this moment, the story does not begin with a ruler or a general. It begins with a whisper. Lucius, a name like a sigh, 26 years old, with shoulders bent slightly from digging. A mason by trade, or at least that's what the city believed. In truth, Lucius had long since become something else, a courier of secrets. And tonight, like many nights, he moves through the subterranean dark with practiced grace, a torch in one hand, a sealed scroll tucked inside his tunic. He does not fear the rats, nor the silence. What unsettles him, what always unsettles him, is the breathing. You see, these tunnels were never truly empty. They echoed with unseen life. Hidden congregations, forbidden rituals, hushed voices that stopped the moment one got too close. Not all of them were sinister. Some were simply waiting. Lucius stops beside an ancient well shaft, its stones older than the Republic itself. Here he pauses listening, not for footsteps, but for the subtle shift of air, the sign that someone else is there. A soft knock, once then twice on the rock wall. He replies the same way. 1, 2. A panel of stone groans open. Behind it, a woman steps into view. Cloaked, hooded, eyes sharp. "You're late," she says, her voice no louder than the scrape of sand on parchment. "I had to change route," Lucius replies. "There's a new patrol sweeping the lower cisterns." She frowns. They're getting closer. They're always getting closer. They stand in silence. Somewhere far above, muffled and distant, a cart rattles over stone. It might be morning by now, or the middle of the night. Down here, time drips like water, slow, directionless. The woman, her name is Tullia, takes the scroll and hides it in her sleeve. She does not ask what it says. That's not her role. Her job is to deliver it further, deeper, into the hands of those who speak in riddles and rarely show their faces. And what do these people want? Not power, not fame. They want history. Not the history the empire carves in marble or inscribes on victory arches, but the real story. The lives of the forgotten. The truths that emperors fear. These scrolls carry testimony. Maps of hidden gatherings. Records of injustice. Symbols of resistance older than any Senate decree. Some call them traitors. Others call them archivists. But in these tunnels, names lose meaning. Identity is a luxury. Lucius watches as Tullia disappears into a crevice barely wide enough for her frame. The wall closes behind her with a whisper of dust. He is alone again, and in that moment, he wonders, not for the first time, if the things they are preserving will ever truly see daylight. If Rome above will ever hear the Rome below. If history, once buried, ever really returns. He sighs, shoulders heavy. He turns, torch crackling, and walks deeper into the dark. Far behind him, unseen by either, a pair of eyes watches. Not hostile, not yet, but curious. Because in this silent war beneath Rome, the most dangerous thing isn't betrayal. It's being noticed. Far below the lavish halls of Domitian's palace, where fountains murmured and polished marble gleamed like captured moonlight, a different world breathed, dank and slow and silent. The air beneath Rome carried centuries of dust and stories never spoken aloud. And somewhere in those shadows, something was stirring. Lucius made his way through the narrow corridor known only to a few, called, in whispers, the Thread. It was one of the oldest tunnels in the Undercity, lined not with brick or carved stone, but packed earth and beams of cedar blackened by age. Every few feet, ancient oil lamps hung like sleeping insects, unlit for decades. Lucius walked in near darkness, letting his torch lick the walls like a cautious tongue. Each step was careful, slow. The thread wasn't stable. Sections collapsed without warning, and some parts had been cursed, or so they said. A superstition? Perhaps. But in a city that buried its secrets rather than burning them, superstition often pointed to something real. Lucius paused at a fork, and there, scratched into the stone, was the mark, a crescent moon etched upside down. That meant safe passage. For now. He turned left. He'd been walking this underworld since he was 17. Back then, he'd followed his older brother, Marcus, into the tunnels on a dare. Marcus, wild-eyed and loud-mouthed, had vanished 2 months later. No body, no witnesses, just a single sandal left at the mouth of a catacomb too narrow for soldiers to enter. Lucius had never stopped walking those tunnels since. The passage opened into a larger chamber, once part of a granary storage vault. The stone walls were cool and curved like the inside of a great stone egg. Here, the ceiling was high enough to stand upright, and benches had been carved from old sarcophagi, long emptied of bones. A handful of people sat there, scattered in silence. Some were dozing, others whispering. There was a man writing on a tablet, using the smooth back of his own knee for balance. A child slept on her mother's lap, her small fingers still clutching a stick of dried fig. Tullia had beaten him there. She stood at the far end, speaking with a man whose beard looked more dust than hair. When she saw Lucius, she gave a small nod, not of greeting but recognition. Lucius didn't sit. He approached a side alcove, where a set of shelves held cloth bundles, sealed jars, and scrolls bound in oilskin. He reached for one near the bottom, marked with a symbol like a fish swallowed by flame. This was his task tonight, to deliver this scroll above ground, disguised as a tradesman's supply list. It would pass through 5 hands before reaching the scribe who copied it in invisible ink. From there, it would be read by only one man, a senator who had once been loyal to the emperor, until the emperor ordered his brother's tongue removed. The silent war was not fought with weapons. It was fought with memory. Lucius slid the scroll into his satchel and turned to leave, but something stopped him. A voice, barely a whisper. They found the archive. He froze. The archive. Not many believed it was real. Supposedly, it was a vault carved beneath the Forum itself, older than Rome, where truths too dangerous to burn were hidden instead. Names, letters, forbidden philosophies. Some said it had been started by slaves, others by senators who foresaw Rome's corruption and wanted to preserve something pure. Lucius stepped closer. Who found it? A woman, older, bent like a shepherd's crook, looked up at him with sunken eyes. Not who, she murmured. What? Tullia joined them then, her face unreadable. We heard from a courier near Ostia. The tunnels there collapsed during a rainstorm. Workers uncovered a sealed chamber. Inside, writing no one could translate, and a symbol carved into the ceiling. The serpent devouring its own tail. Lucius frowned. The Ouroboros. She nodded. They've sealed the site. Domitian's men are already there, but not before one of ours slipped in. Lucius felt a strange tightness in his chest. The kind of feeling that comes when a dream you've long dismissed begins to show teeth. We're sending someone to retrieve the report, Tullia continued. You'll meet them outside the city gates tomorrow. dressed as a spice merchant. "Who is it?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she looked past him toward the far end of the chamber, where a pair of figures had just entered. They were cloaked, hoods drawn low, not unusual in these halls. But something about their posture made the room grow still. Lucius turned slowly, hand instinctively brushing against the hilt of the small knife beneath his cloak. The taller figure stepped forward, and in a voice soft but firm, said only, "The fire is spreading." It was the password, the right one, but still something felt wrong. Lucius stared at them, then at Tullia, who gave no sign of alarm. And yet, in his gut, a chill crept in, like a draft through unseen cracks in a once safe house. Because sometimes in the silent war beneath Rome, even passwords can be stolen. The chamber held its breath. The words had been right. The fire is spreading, but something in the way they'd been spoken was rehearsed. Too careful, as if the speaker had memorized the phrase without understanding its weight. Lucius didn't move, not yet. He glanced at Tullia, watching for the smallest flicker in her eyes. Her face remained calm, but her hand slid slowly toward the satchel at her side. The one that never held food or coins, only documents that weren't supposed to exist. The two cloaked figures stood by the archway, their backs straight, still like marble. Too still. The taller one, the speaker, pulled back his hood. He was young, maybe 20, but with a face already weathered by sun and ambition. His eyes were bright, alert. Too alert. And around his neck, just barely visible beneath his tunic, glinted a strip of bronze. Not a necklace. A tag. Military. Tullia saw it too. Lucius stepped forward, slow as dripping wax. "If the fire is spreading," he said, his voice soft and even, "then tell me, where does it burn the brightest?" The boy hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. The true answer wasn't a word. It was a gesture, 3 fingers to the lips, then the heart. A sign of trust, of secrecy. The boy raised no hand, and that's when the room changed. Before the boy could speak again, Tullia stepped sideways, fast and fluid, knocking over a jar of lamp oil that rolled and burst across the stone floor. She drew a flint from her belt and struck it. Once, sending sparks into the spreading oil. A quick flash, then fire. The room flared gold, smoke curling like vines toward the arched ceiling. People moved, some screamed, and Lucius was already at the side passage, pulling the child and her mother into the shadows, away from what was no longer a meeting, but an ambush. In the chaos, the second cloaked figure moved, not toward the flame, but away fast, disappearing through the door they came in from. The young soldier cursed, shielded his face, and stumbled after them. Lucius didn't follow. He pressed his back against the cold wall, listening as the footsteps vanished. Silence again, but not the comforting kind. Smoke hung like a heavy curtain, and the fire, now dying, left only ash and the sour smell of scorched linen. A few figures remained, coughing dazed. Tullia was gone, vanished in the smoke as always. Lucius stood slowly. His satchel was still there. The scroll was intact, but everything else had changed. That wasn't a raid. It wasn't an arrest. It was a test. Who would run? Who would stay? Who would disappear? They weren't looking to destroy the silent war. Not yet. They were studying it, learning its movements, mapping its lungs. Lucius took a longer path out, through the broken cistern, up the moss-slick steps of an old Mithraic temple, long buried. He emerged near the Tiber, beneath the moonlight, damp with sweat and soot. The river looked calm tonight, indifferent. He walked along its bank in silence, thoughts threading themselves into knots. Had someone spoken, given away the chamber? Or worse, was someone inside already working for them? He remembered the boy's eyes, not cruel, but calculating. The look of someone trained to observe, to remember. They weren't sending assassins. They were sending students. The Empire had decided it was time to learn the language of shadows. And that meant the silent war was no longer silent. By the time Lucius returned to his quarters, dawn was already bleeding faint gold into the horizon. Rome, from a distance, still looked serene. Domes and tiled roofs wrapped in a soft mist, birds beginning their morning dances over the rooftops. It was a city that had no memory of what had happened beneath it in the dark. He entered through a rear stairwell, quiet and unnoticed, as he always did. His modest flat sat above a laundress's shop in the Sabura district, dense, noisy by day, but at this hour hushed. Even a stray dog slept. Inside, he peeled off his soot-streaked tunic and rinsed his arms in a bowl of cold water. The silence of his room comforted him. A single window let in a triangle of pale morning light. Beside it, a low writing desk waited, its surface clean, save for one item, a small wooden carving of a lion's head. He turned it upside down, revealing a slit. Inside, folded and worn, was a message, one written in Marcus's hand. The last one he'd ever received. Not all wars are meant to be won. Some are meant to be remembered. If I disappear, let that be the beginning, not the end. Lucius reread it slowly, as he always did when his hand shook. He let the words settle into his chest like stones dropped into still water. Then he tucked it away and lay down, just for a moment. He didn't expect to dream, but he did. And in that dream, he stood beneath the Forum. Only, it wasn't the Forum of statues and colonnades. It was beneath it, beneath the city, where the pillars were roots and the roads were veins. He saw doors that pulsed like hearts, and walls made of layered scrolls instead of stone. There, standing among them, was Marcus. He didn't speak. He only held out a torch and pointed. Lucius turned and saw a wall, freshly carved, with new writing on it. His name. He woke with a jolt. Outside, the city had fully stirred. Shouts of vendors, clattering wheels, distant music from a lyre. Normal. Ordinary. But inside him, something had shifted. He had to find that chamber in Ostia, the one uncovered in the rain. Because if the archive truly existed, if the records of Rome's buried soul were real, then everything the Silent War had fought for was no longer theory or dream. It was fact, and facts frightened emperors. Lucius dressed in the tunic of a spice merchant, dyed deep rust red, with faint traces of saffron rubbed into the collar. He loaded his satchel with a false inventory scroll and a pouch of dried bay leave for smell. He met the contact near the Milvian Bridge, just as the sun reached its shoulders in the sky. The man was broad-shouldered, with thick brows and a gap between his front teeth. A smile came easily to him, too easily. "You're early," the man said. Lucius simply replied, "I couldn't sleep." "Then it's good we're traveling together," the man said. "Ostia's roads are safest when you look like you're talking." Lucius nodded, then added casually, "You have the list?" The man reached into his sleeve, pulled out a wax-sealed tablet, and handed it over. Spices, oils, and dried fruits. A profitable route. But Lucius felt the tablet's weight. It was too light. Not a list. A decoy. He tucked it away and said no more. They rode a donkey cart out of the city, down the dusty Via Ostiensis, past farmland and olive groves shimmering in the heat. The sky above them was too blue, too vast. Lucius felt exposed. Halfway through the journey, his companion grew quiet. He kept glancing behind them, though no riders followed. "Do you think they know?" he asked. Lucius didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, "They always know something, but not everything." "Are you sure?" "No," Lucius said. "That's why it matters." The man nodded and didn't speak again. Ostia emerged by afternoon, a bustling port city, all salt and sail and shouting. But not for them. They did not enter the Forum of the markets. They turned down a quiet road toward the ruins left half submerged by the flooding rains a week earlier. There, behind a collapsed granary wall, was the entrance. A smooth hole. Fresh earth. Lucius knelt, touched the rim of the opening, and whispered under his breath, "Let this not be another dream." Then he crawled in, and below the weight of empire, deeper than even silence dared travel, he saw something glowing. The tunnel was damp and smelled of ash and wet stone, but Lucius barely noticed. His knees scraped against packed soil as he crawled, fingers brushing the edges of broken brick and ancient roots. Behind him, his travel companion waited above, standing guard beneath the mask of a merchant. If this tunnel closed, if the earth shifted, Lucius would not be rescued. But none of that mattered now, because ahead, faint but unmistakable, there was light. Not torchlight. A strange, steady glow, pale blue, like the shimmer of a full moon on water. He emerged into a hollow space just large enough to stand, though the ceiling sloped low. His torch remained unlit. The glowing came from the walls themselves. Thin veins of translucent mineral, calcite, perhaps, pulsed gently from within the stone. It gave the chamber an otherworldly calm, like standing inside a breath held for centuries. This wasn't Roman construction. The angles were too smooth, the carvings too fluid, nothing militaristic, nothing brutalist. The place felt old but not broken, forgotten, not abandoned. Lucius turned in slow circles, his fingers brushing the walls. Symbols, not Latin, not Greek, and yet somehow familiar. One caught his eye, a circle divided into 3 parts with a dot at the center. He'd seen it before, etched into the edge of a coin left at Marcus's empty bed. A coin older than the Empire, older than even the Republic. Lucius's heart beat louder. There were alcoves, small niches carved into the wall like cradles, and inside them, wrapped in rotting linen and waxcloth, were bundles. Scrolls, dozens of them, some cracked with age, others still sealed with resin or stamped with strange glyphs. No official seal, no imperial emblem, just raw, unfiltered record. He reached out and picked one up. The wax broke with a soft pop. Inside, instead of parchment, was a material he couldn't name. Thin, flexible, dark as bark, and covered with tight, flowing script. The letters danced between alphabets, some Etruscan, some Phoenician, some completely unknown. And yet he understood, not every word, but enough. In the age before stone, before kings wrote their names in thunder, we were watchers. Not of power, but of memory. What is remembered cannot be destroyed. What is forgotten becomes Rome. Lucius sat down, slowly. His breath trembled in his chest. He read another line, then another. Some passages spoke of laws long erased. Others described rituals, peaceful, communal, sacred. There were names, not of emperors, but of midwives, freed slaves, philosophers erased from record. Details so precise it chilled him. The shape of a missing tooth, the way someone hummed while weaving rope, the final words whispered before a quiet death. This wasn't history written by the victorious. It was history whispered by the invisible. Lucius looked up and realized there was no fire in this place. No air current. No dripping water. It was utterly still. Tom did not move here, and yet the chamber lived. He felt it, not as sound, but as presence. As if the stones remembered every footstep. As if, by being here, he had been folded into the archive's memory, too. A soft scraping came from the tunnel behind him. He stiffened. A shape appeared. Not the merchant. Someone smaller. Lighter. Barefoot. A child? The figure stepped into the light. A girl. Maybe 10 years old. Hair in tight braids. Her skin dusted and gray from the tunnel. She looked at Lucius and smiled. Not playfully, but with that quiet gravity children sometimes carry, as if they know something older people forget. "You found it," she said. Lucius opened his mouth, closed it. The girl walked to one of the alcoves and reached in, pulling out a scroll with practiced hands. She held it to her chest. "You'll take some with you," she said. "But not all. The archive chooses what survives." Lucius managed to speak. "Who are you?" The girl tilted her head, as if confused by the question. "I'm part of the remembering," she said. "Like you." Then she turned, walked back toward the tunnel, and disappeared. Lucius stood alone in the pale blue light, holding a story older than Rome. And in that moment, he understood something he couldn't explain. This wasn't a war. It was a rescue. Lucius emerged from the archive, squinting against the afternoon sun, as if he'd forgotten what light could feel like when it came from the sky instead of the earth. Dust clung to his robe, and the faint shimmer of the chamber's glow still lingered in his eyes. The merchant, or the man playing one, stood nearby, arms folded, watching the fields with a false calm. When he saw Lucius crawl out, he gave a short nod. "Well." Lucius didn't answer at first. He wiped his hands on his tunic, then glanced at the distant rooftops of Ostia. "It's real," he said simply. The man let out a long, whistling breath. I figure it might be. Lucius studied him. Then why are you still here? A grin tugged at the man's mouth. Because I'm not here to ask questions. I'm here to take you back alive. Lucius raised an eyebrow. We'll call it a luxury, the man added, shrugging. Most people don't come out of things like this walking. Lucius didn't reply. He just stood, adjusted the strap of his satchel, now heavier with a scroll wrapped carefully in wax cloth, and turned toward the cart. The journey back to Rome was quieter. Even the donkey seemed subdued, as if it had picked up on something unnatural clinging to their skin. Lucius found his thoughts too tangled to speak. He kept turning the girl's words over and over in his mind. The archive chooses what survives. What did that mean? He'd expected to find records, yes, but not consciousness, not presence, not choice. That wasn't Roman. That wasn't anything he'd been trained to understand. By the time the sun began to dip, painting the hills in bronze and fire, the two men were back within view of the city walls. Lucius covered the scroll beneath layers of spice and linen, disguising it with the casual wisdom of 1,000 traders. In Rome, a lie wrapped in something pungent could pass through most gates unnoticed. But at the Porta Trigemina, something had changed. The guard were heavier in number. A new sigil, black eagle on crimson, fluttered from a temporary banner beside the watchpost. It wasn't official. It wasn't imperial. It was private. Mercenaries. Lucius's heart tightened. As the cart approached, one of the guards stepped forward. Younger than expected, freshly shaved, clean armor, but his stance was wrong. Too stiff, too uncertain. Hired sword. Papers, he said. The merchant handed over a worn tablet. Bay leaves, cloves, pepper. Nothing too exciting. The guard flipped through it with feigned disinterest, then peered at Lucius. You? Lucius smiled faintly. Apprentice. The guard squinted at him. You look familiar. Lucius's pulse throbbed in his neck. He kept his voice light. I've been told I look like a man who owes money. A small laugh escaped the merchant. The guard hesitated, then handed the tablet back. Move along. But Lucius saw it just before the cart rolled on. The guard didn't watch them go. He looked at the side of the cart, at the exact spot where Lucius's satchel rested beneath the linen, and smiled. It wasn't the smile of recognition. It was the smile of confirmation. Lucius said nothing as they passed through the gates. But his thoughts raced. Someone had spoken. Someone had pointed. The silent war wasn't just watched now. It was being followed. And still he said nothing. Not to the merchant. Not to the donkey. Not even to the sky. Because once you carried a piece of the archive, you didn't ask for safety. You only asked for time. The following night, Lucius met Tullia beneath a ruined arch near the Aventine Hill. The same place they'd once exchanged coated bread loaves during the grain shortages of Nero's reign. She arrived dressed as a servant, face veiled, posture perfect. Well, she whispered. Lucius nodded once. I found it. Her eyes flickered. She didn't smile. She didn't gasp. She simply took a slow breath, as if anchoring herself to the moment. Then the next part begins, she said. Lucius reached into his satchel and handed her the scroll. She accepted it with both hands, reverent, like it was something alive. I wasn't alone in there, Lucius added, almost reluctantly. There was a girl. Tullia didn't blink. A child? Yes. And she spoke. Yes. Tullia looked away, her gaze distant. Some of the oldest places in Rome never stopped breathing. What we call ruins are sometimes just sleeping mouths. Lucius felt a chill. You knew this could happen? No, she said. But I hoped. She tucked the scroll beneath her cloak. Then, gently, she reached out and rested a hand on Lucius's shoulder. You crossed the line now. You know that, don't you? He nodded. Then go, she said. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, everything changes. But Lucius knew sleep wouldn't come. Not with the archive whispering in the back of his mind. Not with that girl's eyes still watching him from a dark. Not with the silent war beginning, at last, to speak out loud. Night fell over Rome like ink spilled slowly across parchment. The city did not quiet. It never fully did, but its sound softened. Sandals on stone gave way to whispers through alleyways, wine-soaked laughter, distant dogs howling at nothing in particular. Lucius sat by his window, the shutters half closed, watching candlelight flicker across neighboring walls. The streets below moved like a slow dream. Somewhere, someone was playing a panpipe, clumsy but sweet. And in his hands, another scroll. Not from the archive, but one retrieved from a courier near the Tiber. A message encoded in a merchant's manifest, using the usual cipher of weights and miscounted quantities. The message was short. The eagle turns its head. 2 feathers plucked. 1 remains. A warning. The Empire's new mercenary arm, the ones with the crimson eagle banners, had begun acting without Senate oversight. 2 known allies had vanished. 1 remained under watch. Lucius folded the scroll and set it aside, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It was starting. Not the war, no, that had long begun, but the phase where silence became sound, where movements made from the shadows began leaving footprints in daylight. And once that happened, everything changed. There was a knock. 3 slow, 1 fast. The code. Lucius moved to the door and opened it cautiously. A young man stood there, thin, breathless, with dirt streaked across his sleeves. His eyes darted to either end of the hallway before he stepped inside. Message from Ostia, he whispered. Lucius closed the door behind him. Speak. The courier unrolled a piece of rough parchment. On it was a crude map, the coast near Ostia, and a series of tide markings. They've started dredging the collapsed tunnel, he said. But not the city, the sea. Lucius frowned. What? They're looking for another entrance. To the archive? The boy nodded. Or what they think is another entrance. They don't know what it is. They only know it glows. Lucius felt something stir in his chest. Dread. Yes, but something else too. A terrible kind of wonder. What do they find? A chamber, the boy whispered. Half underwater. Carved with writing no one understands. And a body. Lucius's eyes narrowed. A body, the courier nodded. Perfectly preserved. Like it died yesterday. But centuries old. Lucius didn't move. Not for several seconds. Then he said, Did you see it? The boy shook his head quickly. I wasn't allowed near. But the guard spoke of it. Said it had coins placed over the eyes, but not Roman. Round, yes, but made of something they couldn't name. One turned black when touched. Lucius stood very still. Get back to Ostia, he said quietly. Watch them. Don't interfere. Just listen. The boy nodded, then hesitated. They say the eyes, they were open. Lucius turned sharply. The boy stepped back, suddenly unsure of himself. The body, they said its eyes were open. Lucius closed his own eyes, breathed out slowly. Thank you, he said. Now go. The door closed. The apartment was quiet again. Outside, Rome breathed in its sleep, uneven, restless. Lucius returned to his desk and sat down. The map of the coast lay before him. Another chamber, another body, another step down a staircase no one had known existed. He thought of the girl in the archive. I'm part of the remembering, she'd said. What else had been remembered? What else had refused to die? The next morning, Lucius met Tullia at the Temple of Saturn, the one place no one liked to whisper. Too many ghosts in the marble, too many statues with hollow eyes. They sat on opposite ends of a broken column, pretending not to know one another. Heard from Ostia? Tullia asked without looking up. Yes, they found something else. She nodded, unsurprised. They're not just hunting secrets anymore, Lucius said. They're digging into places that don't want to be opened. Tullia tilted her head slightly. What makes you say that? Lucius hesitated. Then, quietly, the body had open eyes. She was silent. Completely. Then, finally, they'll try to move it. Study it. Lucius nodded. And if they do? Tullia stood slowly, dusting off her robe. Then Rome will remember more than it ever wanted to. Lucius looked up at her. Is that what we want? She didn't answer. She simply walked away, her figure swallowed by columns and early morning mist. And Lucius sat alone, the city groaning around him like an old man shifting in his sleep. The silent war was no longer silent. But what would it become when it finally spoke? And who would listen? The next evening, Lucius stood before a mirror in a borrowed tunic of deep blue linen, a little finer than his usual garb, with sleeves stitched in a trader's pattern from the eastern provinces. A quiet disguise, nothing elaborate. In a world above, blending and wasn't about hiding. It was about being unremarkably forgettable. He adjusted the satchel strap over his shoulder. Inside were 4 false scrolls, each bearing an invisible code. One would go to a senator's cook, another to a temple stonemason, one to a courtesan's servant, and the last to an old woman who sold almond cakes from a stall near the forum. Each scroll held a fragment of the archive's latest discovery, pieces of the underwater chamber's markings transcribed from memory by one of their readers, a man known only as Parthas. He had since vanished. Lucius moved quietly through the Transtiberum district, his footsteps light on the cobbled road. The city felt swollen with heat and suspicion. More patrols, more watchful eyes. Even the birds were quieter. And yet Rome moved on. Market stalls still shouted their wares. Bathhouses still steamed with gossip, and lovers still whispered beneath carved porticos. The empire was too large to stop turning, even as its own roots smoldered. The first drop was easy. The cook accepted the scroll with a nod, slipping it into a bag of olives without a word. At the temple, the stonemason didn't even pause his chisel. He merely adjusted the stone lion's expression to appear slightly amused, signaling the exchange was complete. It was at the forum where something changed. Lucius approached the cake seller, just as she was packing up for the evening. Her stall smelled of cinnamon and crushed almonds, the air warm with baked sweetness. "You're late," she said, not looking up. "The streets are slower than usual," he replied. She opened a tin, revealing 2 pastries. "One is yours, one is not." Lucius frowned. The phrase was a signal. Someone had intercepted a drop. He stepped closer. "Ooh." The old woman glanced around the forum, then handed him the pastry. A man with 2 clean boots and the scent of sea salt. "Navy, not local guard." Lucius nodded faintly, took the pastry, and walked away without turning back. The moment he rounded the edge of the basilica wall, he cut down a side path in the shadowed gap between 2 temples. There, among the stone silence of forgotten gods, he waited. A figure followed, cloaked, alone. Lucius didn't move. Let the footsteps grow closer. The man stepped into view, tall, clean-shaven, younger than expected. He looked at Lucius, then held up a small, sealed bottle of oil. "Drop this," he said casually, offering it. Lucius took it slowly. "Thanks." They stood for a moment, strangers in the dark, before the man gave a faint nod and turned to leave. Lucius waited 5 breaths, then uncorked the bottle. Inside was oil, yes, but also a scrap of cloth, rolled tight and soaked. He pulled it free and unwrapped it. A single word, scrawled in hurried ink. "They are reading." Lucius's breath caught. Not listening. Reading. That meant scrolls had been taken. Copied. Maybe even understood. He returned home under cover of darkness, taking routes he hadn't walked in years. Paths once used by thieves, lovers, and others who needed to vanish between lamplit corners. Inside, he locked the door and unrolled a spare tablet. The message he penned was brief. "They are in the archive. They are reading. One of us gave them the key." He sealed it with wax, using a false merchant's signet. Tomorrow it would reach Tullia. Tonight, there was only waiting. Lucius sat beside the window again, watching the lamps flicker along the streets. And for a long time, he didn't move. The archive had been a sanctuary, a memory palace, untouched by time or empire. But now it had been touched, its silence pierced, its story read, and Lucius knew something terrible with a kind of exhausted certainty. The empire wasn't afraid of secrets. It was afraid of forgetting. And men who are afraid to forget are willing to burn everything to remember on their terms. In the days that followed, Rome grew restless, not in noise, but in energy. Something about the rhythm of the streets had shifted. Fewer open conversations, more eyes darting over shoulders. The markets felt brittle. Even the pigeons seemed to gather in tighter flocks, as if instinctively bracing for a storm. Lucius moved through it like a shadow wrapped in skin. He spoke less, slept rarely. When he did, his dreams were odd, full of water, doors, and walls that whispered in languages his waking mind could not recall. He met Tullia again beneath the collapsed aqueduct outside the city. a place once used by smugglers, now theirs. She wore her hair differently now, bound in a plain cord, the kind a servant might use. It made her harder to recognize. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she held out a scroll. No seal, no name. Lucius took it and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sentence. The child walks in daylight. He looked up. What does that mean? Tully's jaw was tight. A merchant's son, in the Subura, said he met a girl in a tunnel beneath the bakery. She showed him a glowing wall. He described her. It was her, Lucius. His mouth went dry. She left the archive. She was seen. Above ground. In sunlight. Lucius shook his head slowly. That shouldn't be possible. That chamber was sealed, bound, hidden. Tully's voice was low, sharp, and yet she was there. Lucius turned away, staring at the pale hills beyond the city walls. Why would she come up? Tully didn't answer. Instead, she handed him another scroll, this one thicker, more worn. From the underwater chamber, she said. One of Parthas's last copies before he disappeared. Lucius unrolled it slowly. It wasn't a record. It was a warning. When memory becomes visible, the forgetting becomes violent. The archive must not seek light. Only fire waits there. He read it again, slower, and then a third time. A strange stillness bloomed in his chest, the kind that comes not from fear, but from knowing you've wandered too far into a forest you cannot find your way out of. Talia whispered, They think the Empire is just curious. That Domitian's men are collecting scrolls, that the Navy is mapping tunnels to feel safe. But Lucius, they're preparing to erase. His head snapped toward her. Burn it. No, she said. Worse. She handed him a third scroll. This one had come through unofficial channels. From a senator's slave who kept his ears open and his mouth closed. The scroll was a transcript of a meeting. The inner circle of Domitian's court, speaking in code. It read, The infection spreads through memory. The cure is crafted not in violence, but in myth. We will write over what was found. We will call it madness. We will rename their truths. And we will teach it in schools for the next 1,000 years. Lucius stared. They're not destroying the archive, he said softly. They're rewriting it, Talia finished. A soft wind passed between them, carrying dust and the scent of crushed time. Lucius sat down heavily on the stone ledge of the aqueduct. They're going to use it. Talia nodded. Not as truth, but as script. Turn the memory into a performance, he muttered. Put in their mouth. Their version. Exactly. Lucius felt sick. That's worse than fire. Talia said nothing, because they both knew fire can't be undone, but a lie told long enough becomes the only thing people remember. That night, Lucius found himself back in the tunnels. Alone. He wasn't heading to a meeting. He wasn't delivering a scroll. He just walked. He let the dust cling to his sandals. Let the torch burn low. Let the darkness breathe. He passed the crescent mark, the one scratched on the wall years ago by Marcus. He stopped before a narrow passage where the air turned strangely warm. And there, in the silence, he heard it. A soft humming. A child's voice. He turned. She was there. The girl from the archive. Not frightened. Not glowing. Just present. Sitting on a stone. Humming a tune that made no sense and perfect sense all at once. Lucius stepped forward, heart pounding. Why are you here again? The girl looked up, eyes impossibly deep. Because you stopped remembering, she said. I haven't, Lucius whispered. She tilted her head. You're remembering fear, not truth. He knelt before her. Tell me what to do. The girl reached out and touched his chest, lightly. Be the breath between forgetting, she said. That's all we ever are. Then she stood and walked away, barefoot and silent, leaving Lucius alone again. But not empty, because now he remembered what the war was really for. The next morning, Lucius awoke before the light. He didn't know how long he'd slept, only that his dreams had been wordless but vivid, full of ink and fire, a strange comfort laced with sorrow. He lit a small oil lamp and unwrapped the scroll the girl had handed him the night before. It wasn't parchment. It felt like pressed bark, rough but pliable, as if it had once been alive. There were markings carved into it, flowing in spirals and curves instead of the neat lines of Roman script. No translation, no title, but Lucius didn't need one, because when he ran his fingers across the surface, he didn't read. He remembered. A village once buried by ash, where people sang their names into the walls of their homes so they wouldn't be forgotten. A garden of carved stones that whispered the laughter of lost children. A woman kneeling in a cold stream, washing blood from a tunic that had never known war. These weren't facts. They were moments, lived memory. And Lucius finally understood what the archive really was. Not a vault, not a weapon, not a threat to power. It was a heartbeat, one that didn't belong to Rome, one that had survived Rome. He set the scroll down gently and dressed in plain clothes. Not a disguise, not this time. He wanted to be seen as he truly was. That day, he walked the city with new eyes. The streets weren't just stone and noise. They were layered with ghosts. Every arch, every cracked statue, every chipped step held stories that had never made it into the Senate records. He watched two women laughing over spilled grain and thought, "You deserve to be remembered." He saw an old man sitting outside a bathhouse with no sandals and thought, "Your life is not a footnote." He passed the Temple of Janus, both doors open, as they always were in times of unrest, and thought, "They will try to close you with lies." But truth, Lucius now saw, didn't need doors. It seeped through cracks. It sang through children. It waited in silence until someone was ready to listen. In the afternoon, he returned to the chamber beneath the forum. Not the archive itself. No, that had become too dangerous. But one of its roots, a dry cistern once used as storage, now repurposed as a message drop. Talia was there, seated cross-legged on a blanket, her hands ink-stained, her expression distant. "I've copied the pattern from the scroll," she said softly as Lucius approached. "Every mark, but I don't know what it says." Lucius knelt beside her. "It doesn't say anything." She blinked. "What?" He met her eyes. "It remembers. It's not meant to be read. It's meant to be felt. Absorbed. Like sunlight." Talia didn't answer for a moment. Then she looked down at her hands. "We've been playing their game too long, haven't we?" Lucius nodded. "They hoard power by deciding who gets remembered. But memory doesn't belong to them. It was never theirs to begin with." A long pause. Then Talia said, "We'll make copies. Spread them. Let the people see what memory feels like, even if they don't understand it yet." Lucius reached for her hand. "Not copies." She tilted her head. He smiled faintly. "Let's plant them." That night, they buried the first scroll beneath a fig tree in the Subura, where children often played in the dust. No plaque, no warning, no inscription, just a bark scroll, wrapped in cloth, tucked into the soil. Maybe one day someone would find it. Maybe they wouldn't, but the ground would remember. And in a city built on ruins and myth, sometimes the most powerful act was not to fight, but to quietly seed. The morning after the burial, Rome awoke under a thin veil of mist, the kind that softened everything it touched, statues, temples, soldiers. It felt almost like the city was trying to forget itself for a little while. Lucius walked with his hood down, blending not by disguise, but by stillness. He no longer rushed. He didn't flinch when soldiers passed. Fear had changed shape in him. It had quieted. It had turned into something else. Resolve. He met with two of their oldest allies that day. Not fighters, not spies, but people who understood what it meant to carry memory without needing to explain it. The first was an actress named Calvina. She performed at a backstreet theater in the Transtiberum, usually in comedies full of masks and mistaken identities. But offstage, her mind was sharper than most philosophers. Lucius found her backstage, her hair pinned up with bone combs, grease paint still wet beneath her eyes. "Another scroll?" she asked before he even spoke. He smiled. "No, a roll." She arched a brow. He lowered his voice. "I need you to speak a memory out loud, one that's never been spoken before." She leaned in, curious now. "For an audience?" "No," Lucius whispered. "For the air." That afternoon, Calvina stood before an empty courtyard in the Palatine district, the one where, rumor had it, an emperor's mistress once vanished without a trace. She sang a lullaby from the archive, her voice delicate but firm. It was in a language no one around her knew, but it made dogs pause, made birds fall silent. When she was done, she bowed to no one and walked away. But something in the wind had changed. The second ally was a baker. Gaius. His name was, though no one ever used it. They just called him Warm Hands. He had flour in his beard and ashes on his sleeves, and no one ever suspected him of being anything but kind. Lucius visited him just as the ovens were cooling. "I want to hide something in your loaves," Lucius said. Gaius looked at him, then at the small bark scroll. "Seeds again?" he asked, amused. Lucius nodded. The baker chuckled. "And if a senator swallows one?" Lucius shrugged. "Then maybe he'll dream something worth remembering." That evening, 5 loaves were sent to 5 different corners of the city, each to someone who had once whispered truth in private, who had once asked questions too dangerous to write down. None of the scrolls were labeled, but each one hummed softly with memory. By the week's end, the silent war had shifted its tactics. No more meetings, no more signals and olives and oil jars. Instead, the network became something else, something even Rome couldn't catalog. A woman humming an unknown tune as she swept her doorstep. A line of children etching unfamiliar symbols in dust with their toes. A mural, painted over quickly, but not before 3 slaves memorized its shape. A butcher who began wrapping his meat in paper marked with a spiral no one could translate. The memory was no longer being carried. It was being woven, and Rome didn't know what to do with that. You can censor a scroll. You can jail a messenger. But you cannot arrest the air. You cannot exile a song once someone hums it in their sleep. You cannot burn something the earth itself has begun to remember. Late one night, Lucius found himself standing outside the prison on the Esquiline Hill. Not to break anyone out, but to listen, because sometimes the walls there echoed. Not cries, not chants, but words, old ones. He leaned close, ear nearly to the stone, and there was again a whisper, so faint it could have been wind. "We are still here." Lucius smiled, not because the war was over, but because now it knew they were listening. Outside, the sky turned a soft, bruised violet. That quiet hour between dusk and night when the city forgot to be proud for a moment. Fires were being lit in homes. Oil lamps flickered like little stars down alleyways, and the scent of rosemary smoke drifted lazily over rooftops. Lucius stood atop the Janiculum Hill, the highest point in Rome, looking out across the layers of his city. He could trace the dome of the Capitol, the twisting alleys of the Subura, the long spine of the Forum stretching like a question without an answer. Behind him, footsteps approached. Tullia. She had climbed without a sound, a habit born of necessity. Lucius didn't turn. They've begun rewriting the archive's symbols into temple murals. "I know," she said. "They're changing the shapes just slightly, enough to distort meaning, enough to sever the memory from itself." "I know," she said again, but softer now. Lucius finally turned to look at her. She was holding a stone tablet, no bigger than her hand. Upon it, etched with a sharp tool, was a spiral, delicate, precise, the original form. Below it, a newer version, distorted and hollow. "They're teaching the new one in schools," she whispered, calling it a symbol for order. Lucius felt the heaviness behind his eyes. But the original meant memory. She nodded. And not just memory. Shared memory. The kind you don't own, but carry. A pause hung between them, thick with what wasn't being said. Lucius stepped closer. "How many of us are still alive?" "Enough," Tullia replied. Then, after a breath, but not for long, he looked down at the tablet again. "It's not the erasure that scares me," he murmured. "It's the replacement. The way a lie can settle in like dust and call itself home." Tullia stared out over the city. "So we stop lying?" He raised an eyebrow. "Not in words," she said. "In presence. We become memory. We live it so clearly they can't rewrite us without looking ridiculous." Lucius smiled faintly. "They'll still try." She smiled too. "Of course. But memory has teeth when it refuses to go quietly." They stood there a while longer, letting the night unfurl around them. Down in the Forum, torches were being lit. A procession of soldiers marched in practiced rhythm. Likely symbolic, likely pointless. Yet the sound echoed through the city like thunder pretending to matter. Lucius turned to go, but Talia caught his sleeve. "I need you to do something," she said. "Anything." She handed him a thin sheet of wax, rolled tight, sealed with a pressed thumb. "Take this to the girl." Lucius stilled. "The child from the archive?" "She's been seen again, near the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer." Talia hesitated. She was leaving chalk symbols on the wall. "Not for us." Lucius frowned. "Then for who?" Talia didn't answer. "Just find her. Give her this." Lucius tucked the wax roll into his cloak. "And if she doesn't take it, she will," Talia said. "It's not for her hands. It's for her memory." That night, Lucius returned to the underbelly of Rome, past the aqueduct ruins beneath the temples, into the bones of the empire. The air grew thick and damp. Water dripped from moss-covered ceilings. The Cloaca Maxima breathed like an old lung, slow and deep. And there she was, the girl, sitting barefoot at the edge of a broken arch, legs dangling over dark water. She looked up when he approached. Her eyes were not surprised. "You came," she said. "I brought something," Lucius replied. She didn't hold out her hand. He didn't offer the wax roll. Instead, he sat beside her. They watched the water for a long time. Then she said, "The memory is not mine. It only wears my shape." "I know," he whispered. "I can't carry it forever." "You're not meant to," he said. "That's why we're here." Finally, she reached out and touched his shoulder, not gently, but firmly. "Then take it," she said, "not as a story, as a promise." Lucius nodded. The wax roll, untouched, pulsed lightly between them, and the water below rippled, though no wind passed through the stone. In the days that followed, Lucius carried the wax scroll everywhere he went. He didn't open it. Not yet. Somehow, he understood that it wasn't time, that memory, like fruit, could spoil if rushed. Instead, he walked, listened, watched. Rome seemed unaware of what was unfolding beneath its marble skin. Or perhaps not unaware, just unwilling to notice. It's a trait of great cities. The more history they hold, the more skilled they become at ignoring it. But subtle changes had begun. A soldier outside the Temple of Castor, humming a tune no one remembered teaching him. A street urchin drawing spiral patterns on a senator's door, unaware of what they meant. A teacher caught off guard when a student recited a lullaby that had no Latin origin and cried, though she didn't know why. Memory was moving, not shouted, not written, but lived. And it was infecting Rome in ways the empire didn't have tools to fight. One evening, Lucius met with Gaius the baker again. The man's hands were dusted with flour, but his eyes were grave. "They searched the bakery last night," he said. Lucius stiffened. "Did they find anything?" "No," Gaius smiled wearily. "Because I moved it all, even the seeds." "Where?" Gaius gestured vaguely toward the Tiber. "Buried them along the banks. One beneath a fig tree, one behind the old statue of Flora, another inside an amphora. Let the earth remember for a while." Lucius clasped his shoulder. "You've done more than most senators ever will." Gaius chuckled. "I just bake bread, friend." Lucius leaned in. "You carry stories in the crust." They parted with quiet nods, no words wasted. Later that night, Lucius finally returned to the small apartment tucked near the forum's edge. He lit a single candle and sat beside the hearth. He unrolled the wax scroll. Inside, no text, no names, just a single pressed image etched carefully into the surface. A flame, encircled, but the flame was upside down, not rising but descending. Beneath it, a faint carving of a human figure, arms raised. Not in surrender, not in worship, but in witness. Lucius ran his finger over the image. The wax was warm, though no heat touched it. He blinked, and for a brief moment, he wasn't in his room. He was standing on a hill, not in Rome, somewhere older, the sky dark, thick with stars, and beneath his feet, a burial ground. Thousands of small stones, each carved with names never spoken aloud. And the girl was there, but older now, not a child, not quite a woman. She said nothing. She simply was. Lucius felt tears on his cheeks and didn't wipe them away, because he understood. This war was not about power, or politics, or even empire. It was about presence, the choice to remember, the courage to be remembered, even when the world preferred silence. When Lucius woke, and yes, he realized now it had been a kind of waking dream, the scroll had dissolved in a fine powder. No trace, but the image remained in his mind, clear as the day. A downward flame, a silent witness. The next day, he painted it, not on a wall, not on parchment, but onto the inside of his wrist, using ink mixed with ash from the archive chamber. It was not a rebellion. It was a record. The mark on Lucius's wrist never faded. He tried to scrub it once, not out of shame, but fear. But the ink, though faint, remained, almost as if his skin had chosen it. He wore it like a secret scar, though it didn't hurt. It wasn't meant to. It was there to remind him that he was no longer just a scribe, or a messenger, or even a protector of memory. He was a vessel now, and Rome was listening, though it pretended not to. The new rumor in the forum was that Domitian's scribes were commissioning a great chronicle, a single master scroll meant to unify the empire's fractured histories. One story, one truth. Lucius couldn't help but smile when he heard it. The louder the official voice becomes, the more people begin to question why it needs to shout at all. He walked past a gathering near the steps of the Temple of Vesta, where a young boy was telling stories to an enthralled knot of children. And then the river opened, the boy was saying, and the girl with eyes like moonlight stepped out of the stones. Lucius paused. The boy couldn't have been more than 10. He wore a tunic 2 sizes too large and sandals made from scrap leather. But his voice was clear, confident. And she didn't speak, the boy continued, but everyone heard her anyway. Not with ears, but with their bones. One of the girls leaned forward. What did she say? The boy thought for a moment, then said simply. She said, "You were always here." Lucius didn't interrupt, didn't step forward. He only watched. Because this was it. The archive wasn't a place anymore. It had become a story. One told in whispers, in drawings, in flower dust, and lullabies. It was hiding in plain sight, where no legion could reach it. That night, Lucius met Tullia in the ruins of a bathhouse long since abandoned. Moonlight poured in through cracks in the ceiling, pooling like water on the floor. She was waiting with a new scroll, this one short but weighty. "They're moving faster now," she said, sending envoys to Alexandria, gathering old texts, buying silence with gold. Lucius unfolded the scroll. It was a list of names, scholars, librarians, storytellers. Tullia added, "Some are disappearing." Lucius looked at the names. One made his chest tighten. Calla Verinius, a philosopher who had once debated with Lucius for 3 hours straight about whether memory could be an act of rebellion. "She taught me to listen," he whispered. "She's gone," Tullia replied. "No one knows where." Lucius rolled up the scroll. "Then it's time we stop hiding." Tullia frowned. "You mean, we go public," he said. A long pause. "Lucius," she said gently, "you do know what that means?" He nodded. "It means someone has to burn. But not in fire, in reputation. Someone has to fall loudly enough that Rome turns its head. Not away toward." "And you want to be the flame?" she asked. "No," he said. "I want to be the match." 3 days later, Lucius stood in the middle of the Senate steps. Alone. He wore plain robes. No scrolls. No these guys. Just his voice. And a mark on his wrist. He began to speak. Softly at first, like a priest reciting a quiet litany. "Rome was not built on stones," he said. "It was built on stories. And every one you erase, every voice you silence, is another brick pulled from beneath our feet." Passers-by slowed. A few senators paused from their pompous stride. Lucius raised his voice, not in anger, but resonance. "The archive is not treason. Memory is not rebellion. But to fear it is..." And then, slowly, he raised his wrist, showed the mark, gasped from the crowd. Someone shouted, "He bears the forbidden sign." Another, "Take him." But Lucius didn't run. He stood still, calm, as hands gripped his arms and pulled him down the steps, as his knees scraped stone, as the crowd parted like frightened sheep. A child's voice rang out. "He's not a threat." Everyone turned. It was a girl. No one had seen her approach. Her hair was dark, her feet bare, Her gaze ancient. "He's a mirror," she said. "You're just scared to look." And then she was gone, vanished, as if Rome had swallowed her back into its bones. Lucius, bleeding and bound, was thrown into a holding cell beneath the forum. But he smiled through the blood, because even in chains, the memory had spoken, and it was not done. The cell was damp. Ancient stone, older even in the Republic, hugged the cold. Moss crept between the cracks. The kind of silence that settles underground was absolute, a silence that didn't sleep but listened. Lucius sat with his back against the wall, wrists raw from the iron bindings. His robe was torn at the hem, his lips split, yet he felt strangely calm, almost lighter than he had in months. For once, there was no message to carry, no code to memorize, no lie to outmaneuver. He had done what he set out to do. He had spoken memory aloud, in daylight, where Rome could not pretend it hadn't heard. Now the city had a choice. Ignore him, punish him, call him mad, or wonder, because wondering, even for a heartbeat, is how remembering begins. Outside the cell, in the city above, the whispers were already beginning to stir. A woman who sold pears in the forum claimed she saw a girl disappear into thin air. A slave delivering wine to the temple of Jupiter swore a boy handed him a coin that turned warm in his hand and left a spiral impression in the clay amphora he carried. A senator's wife found a mark, the flame in the circle, etched on the underside of her favorite comb. No one could trace these things, but they lingered, and the more Rome tried to suppress them, the louder the silence grew. Lucius drifted into sleep in the cell, but not the dreamless kind. He stood again at the edge of the archive, but this time the chamber was filled not with scrolls, but with people, faces he knew and many he didn't. Gaius the baker stood beside Calvina, the actress. The girl from the tunnels stood barefoot, holding a torch made of woven olive branches. Tullia was there, her fingers dipped in ink, leaving marks on stone, and one by one, they each placed a single object in the center of the chamber. A broken ring, a child's sandal, a bread crust, a painted tile. None of them spoke, but the room pulsed with warmth. The kind of warmth that doesn't come from fire, but from presence. Lucius stepped forward. In his hand, nothing. He had no artifact to offer. No scroll, no relic. But the girl reached out, touched his chest, and whispered, "You carry it already." And then the dream faded. He awoke to footsteps, not a soldier's march. Softer, careful. The door creaked open. Torchlight flickered, revealing a familiar figure. Tullia. She didn't speak. Not at first. Then, they haven't sentenced you yet, which means they're uncertain. Lucius managed a faint smile. Good. Let them squirm. She stepped closer and crouched beside him. In her hands, a folded scrap of linen. Inside it, a simple wooden token, carved with the upside-down flame. "They're appearing everywhere," she said. "No one admits to carving them, but they're showing up on market stalls, temple benches, even coin molds." Lucius turned the token over in his palm. "They can erase stories," he murmured, "but they can't erase feeling. Not once it's seated." Tullia leaned in. "We're not saving the archive, Lucius. We're the archive now." He nodded, then whispered, "And that means they've already lost." Later that night, a guard opened the cell, said nothing, just gestured. Lucius followed, not because he was free, he knew better, but because Rome, in its own way, had decided not to kill him. Not yet. They feared martyrs more than memories. So they exiled him, quietly. No crowd, no trial, just a boat waiting on the banks of the Tiber. He turned only once as the boat drifted away, toward the dome of the city, aglow in moonlight. A soft breeze stirred the water. The air smelled of olive wood and dusk. And far behind, almost too soft to hear, someone began to hum. A tune that didn't belong to any Roman hymn. A tune he knew from a dream. A lullaby from the archive. The memory was alive, and it was already moving on. The boat drifted silently down the Tiber, its oars unused, guided by current and time. Lucius sat alone near the stern, wrapped in a wool cloak that smelled faintly of fig smoke. Rome shrank behind him, its columns and towers dissolving into the darkness like a fading memory. He did not know where he was being sent, That was the point. Exile was not always a destination. Sometimes it was a tactic, a way for power to say, "We can't kill you, but we can pretend you don't exist." Lucius watched the stars. The same stars that had watched over emperors, poets, and prisoners alike. He thought of the girl, of the mark on his wrist, of the whisper in the archive. "You were always here." Days passed, then a week. The boat docked at a nameless inlet, where 3 soldiers left him on a sun-bleached shore with a sack of grain, a knife, and a warning not to return. He didn't ask where he was. It didn't matter. Memory travels better than men. He wandered inland, sleeping beneath olive trees, drinking from cold streams. The land was gentle, quiet, and soon he found others. Not many. A shepherd, a weaver, an old man who made ink from crushed berries and carried more silence than speech. But Lucius noticed something strange. Each of them, in subtle ways, remembered. The weaver sang to herself in a melody that echoed the rhythms of the archive's lullabies. The shepherd had carved a spiral into the wood of his crook. The old man, without knowing why, kept a fire burning every night and told stories to no one. Lucius began to help them, mending fences, fixing clay ovens. But more than anything, he listened. He asked questions, small ones, soft ones, and slowly the stories came. One woman remembered a dream she had as a child, where a tower turned to dust and birds flew out singing names. Another told of a cave where the walls glowed, though no fire had ever touched them. Lucius didn't correct them, didn't interpret. He just carried the stories like embers. Let them warm him. Let them live. One evening, as he sat beside a makeshift hearth, not quite a fireplace, but close enough, a young boy approached. He had wild hair, dirt-streaked knees, and eyes that carried something ancient. He said nothing at first, just held out a flat stone. Lucius took it, etched into its surface with a careful hand. It was the same flame he'd worn on his wrist. But this one had 2 figures beneath it now, standing side by side, arms raised not in surrender, but in welcome. Lucius looked up, stunned. "Where did you find this?" he asked. The boy shrugged. Didn't find it, just remembered it. Lucius felt something stir in his chest. Not quite sorrow, not quite joy. Perhaps, like the moment before a candle is lit, when the air already knows what's coming. That night, Lucius sat before the fire and began carving. Not a scroll, not a message, just marks, symbols, familiar ones. He wasn't recording history. He was planting it again, not in stone, but in hands, in stories, in the next breath. Because even in exile, even in silence, the archive lived, and now it was learning how to grow. By spring, the hills where Lucius had been cast into exile were dotted with whispers. Not spoken, not exactly, but woven, painted, hummed. A clay jug passed hand to hand bore a faint spiral near its base, barely visible under the glaze. A child's tunic, hand-stitched by her grandmother, had tiny thread patterns shaped like a downward flame. Even the trees seemed to bend slightly in rhythm with a melody no one admitted to knowing. Lucius never called it teaching. He never formed a school, never stood before a crowd. Instead, he became a quiet part of the rhythm, showing villagers how to listen, how to mark, how to share. Not facts, not scripts, but feelings. He would sit with a basket weaver as she worked and say, "Tell me about the oldest dream you remember," or help patch a roof and ask, "When was the last time you saw something that didn't make sense but felt true?" They thought he was strange, but kind, and when he left their doorsteps, they found themselves humming, or carving little symbols into fence posts, or writing letters they never sent. Memory had become contagious. One day, Lucius found the shepherd again, the one whose staff bore the spiral. The man was older now, his beard gone white, his limbs slower, but his eyes clearer, brighter. "I had a dream," he told Lucius, "about a river of fire that didn't burn. It flowed backward into the past." Lucius nodded, and the shepherd smiled. "I dipped my hand into it, and when I pulled it out, I could see my wife again, as she was, before the cough, before the quiet." Lucius swallowed hard. "That wasn't a dream," he whispered. "That was memory letting you visit." The shepherd leaned back and closed his eyes. If that's what your archive gives, I'm glad they feared it. Lucius said nothing, but he stayed with the old man until the sun dipped low behind the olive trees. And when the shepherd finally slipped into a deeper sleep, Lucius carved the spiral into the headstone himself, small at the base. A promise made of stone. News came weeks later, carried not by courier, but in the folds of a traveler's song. Domitian was dead, assassinated in his chambers. The city had erupted, not in grief, but in confused silence. Statues were torn down, his name chiseled off monuments, his policies undone in whispers. Rome had begun rewriting itself again, just as the archive had always feared. But this time, the memory was faster. Lucius watched as news spread through the villages not as decree, but music. A new song, gentle but defiant. Children skipping through fields saying lines like, "The emperor fell where stories rose. He built a wall, but forgot the door." Poets wrote elegies to no one, half-truths wrapped in honeyed rhyme, passed between hands like bread. And Lucius saw it clearly now. Rome was not built on conquest. It had always been built on story, and now the stories were slipping free of their cages. That night, Lucius stood on the hill above his village, a single torch in hand. He raised it slowly, the flame dancing. Below, across fields and rooftops, dozens of small fires answered him. One by one. No signal, no instruction, just understanding. They remembered, and now they were ready. The fires that answered Lucius's torch did not roar. They did not burn with the fury of rebellion or the destruction of siege. They glowed, steady, warm, like hearths in 1,000 homes, each one whispering, "We're still here. We've always been here." Lucius stood until the wind died down and the stars brightened. He watched the last flicker from a distant valley fade into a soft orange ember, and only then did he lower his torch. This wasn't victory, but it was a beginning. The next morning he began to walk, not in retreat. In return, he would go back to Rome, not to kneel, not to fight, but to remind. It took weeks. He moved like water, flowing around patrols, sleeping in barns, bartering stories for bread. The road had changed. Where once it had been lined with statues and border guards, now it was quieter, looser, as if the empire itself were blinking in confusion. Domitian's death had cracked something, and through that crack, memory was spilling. In one town, a local painter showed Lucius a mural she had finished the week after the news broke. A figure standing in a field of symbols, holding a torch that lit not fire, but stars. In another, a boy handed Lucius a small stone tablet. On it, in careful lines, was the flame, but wrapped now in vines and roots. Lucius asked, "What does it mean to you?" The boy shrugged. "It grows." Lucius smiled. "Yes, it does." He reached the outskirts of Rome just as spring turned into early summer. The city shimmered in the heat, and the Tiber ran low and slow, like a dragon too tired to stir. Lucius didn't hide his face. He walked through the gates as if he belonged, because he did, even if the empire had once said otherwise. The forum buzzed with half-formed thoughts. Senators argued over new laws. Temples reopened under new dedications, and rumors spread like vines, thick, tangled, and often rooted in something real. Lucius sat by a public fountain, sipping water and watching. He didn't speak at first, but people began to notice him. An old woman paused, squinting. "You're the one who stood on the Senate steps." Lucius nodded. A butcher's apprentice whispered. "They said you vanished, that you were dead." He looked at the boy and replied softly, "Not dead, just remembered differently." By midday, a small crowd had gathered. Lucius didn't raise his voice. He didn't climb a platform. He simply began to tell a story about a girl with eyes like moonlight who carried memory in her hands, about a hidden chamber beneath the earth where truth hummed instead of shouted, about a city that forgot itself and then quietly, gently began to wake up. People didn't interrupt. They listened, not with awe, but with familiarity, because some of them had dreamed that story. Others had sung pieces of it without knowing why. And some had felt it bloom in their chest like a secret they had never named. When Lucius finished, he stood. He didn't ask anything of them. He didn't call for action. He simply said, if memory is dangerous, then we must be very careful who we trust to forget for us. And then he walked away. That evening, a spiral was found carved into the base of a statue of Jupiter. The next day, a senator's speech was interrupted by the gentle chant of children singing a lullaby no one could quite trace. And that week, dozens of people, potters, scribes, cooks, midwives, all reported dreaming of a room filled with light and the soft voice of a girl who never said her name. The archive had returned, not as scrolls, but as people, and this time, it would not be buried. That summer, Rome bloomed with forgotten things. Not visibly, not in grand processions or proclamations, but in subtler ways. A faded mural near the Temple of Saturn was cleaned by a group of young painters. Not restored to its official version, but to the colors it once wore beneath years of imperial edits. A baker began stamping her loaves with a small spiral, not for defiance, but because her grandmother had drawn the symbol in flour when she was a child. And one morning, someone hung a wreath of olive branches and river stones at the base of a statue of Domitian, a silent gesture, neither mocking nor mourning, just remembering. Lucius moved through the city now without disguise. He spoke when asked. Listen more often. People no longer asked what the archive was. They asked, what does it remember about me? What did it carry that I lost? Am I part of it too? And the answer, always, was yes. Because memory, as it turned out, didn't belong to rulers or record keepers. It belonged to those who needed it most, the ones who survived. One evening, Lucius returned to the chamber beneath the forum. The path was overgrown now, not with vines, but with symbols, scratched into walls, woven into discarded cloth, inked onto broken amphory. The entrance was partially sealed, not locked, just softened by time. He lit a lamp and stepped inside. The archive was not as he remembered. Many scrolls were gone. Others crumbled into dust. But in their place were voices. Soft ones. From the walls. From the floor. From the memory-soaked air. A song hummed gently, without source. It was not in Latin. Not even a language Lucius recognized. But he understood it. It was a song of continuation. Of seed and soil. Of silence that had chosen to speak. In the center of the chamber stood something new. A small, round basin carved from stone, filled with water. Floating in it, a single petal. Lucius bent down, touched the water. It was warm. He didn't ask how it got there, or who placed it. He only whispered, "Thank you." And the chamber answered, not in words, but in presence, like a friend sitting beside you in the dark, saying nothing, but reminding you you're not alone. He stayed a while, not as a guardian, not as a keeper, just as one more vessel, another link in a chain that stretched backward and forward at once. When he rose to leave, he left no mark, because nothing more needed to be said. The archive was no longer hidden. It was everywhere, and above ground, the city pulsed with its heartbeat. A woman in the market turned to her son and said, "That's not how it happened," and began to tell a different version of a well-known tale. A retired soldier woke from a dream and dug into his garden, uncovering a coin marked with a forgotten emblem. And somewhere, in a workshop, in a poem, in a whispered lullaby, the story kept unfolding. Soft, endless, alive. Summer deepened, and Rome softened under its heat. The stones of the forum glowed in the late sun, and the shadows stretched longer, as if the city itself were leaning backward into memory. Lucius sat beneath a fig tree not far from the old aqueduct. A boy beside him traced circles in the dirt with a stick. A spiral, then a flame. Then something new, a symbol Lucius didn't recognize. "What's that?" he asked gently. The boy shrugged. "It came to me." Lucius nodded. That's how it starts. He'd stopped trying to control the archive. It no longer needed guardians. The memory had learned how to remember itself. In every corner of the empire, quiet revolutions unfolded. Not coups, not riots, but songs. A merchant in Ostia told a story to a group of dockhands about a girl who whispered to bricks and made them remember the names of slaves. In a villa in Capua, a noblewoman embroidered the downward flame into the hem of her bed linens, not as protest, but as prayer. And in a crowded alley of the Subura, a group of children formed a game. They would chant a phrase none of them had learned aloud. We do not forget what holds us. No one knew where it came from, but it spread like fire wrapped in velvet. Lucius watched this unfold not as leader, but as witness. He spent his days walking, listening, planting questions. When someone asked, "What is the archive now?" he smiled and said, "It's the dream you wake up from and still remember. It's the silence that feels familiar. It's the thing you always knew, but never had the words to say." People nodded, because everyone had felt that silence at least once. Now, they knew it had a name. One day, Lucius returned to the theater where Calvina had once performed. It was mostly abandoned, the stage warped, curtains moth-eaten, but he stepped inside anyway. In the center of the dusty floor, someone had drawn a large circle in chalk. Inside it, dozens of smaller spirals. And in the very middle, a single word. Respira. Breathe. Lucius stood there a long time, barefoot now, letting the quiet wrap around him. He thought of how many voices had once filled this space. How many stories had risen and vanished in the air. He whispered, "Are you still listening?" And the rafters creaked. The walls pulsed. The air felt full. Yes, the archive was listening. And breathing, too. That night, Lucius returned to the river. He sat on the same bank where he'd once been left for exile. But now he was not alone. Tullia joined him, her hair braided with olive leaves. She didn't ask questions. She simply took his hand. They sat in silence, watching fireflies dance over the water. Then she said, "It's not a war anymore." "No," Lucius agreed. "It's a language." She turned to him. "And who speaks it?" He looked at her, at the flickering lights, at the stars. "Anyone who chooses to remember," he said. Rome would go on. It would change, crumble, rebuild, rename itself. Empires would rise and fall, emperors crowned and forgotten. But the archive would remain, not in scrolls, but in people, in breath, in the quiet firelight of those who choose to carry memory, even when the world prefers silence. Autumn came to Rome like a deep exhale. The streets grew quieter. The wind carried a scent of dry leaves and distant smoke, and even the city's fountains gurgled more slowly, as if whispering to themselves. Lucius felt the shift, not just in the season, in the people. There was a new weight to the silence between conversations, a kind of listening. More and more, people had stopped waiting for permission to remember. They simply did. A potter etched forgotten words into the base of every cup. A musician played a melody no one taught him, but everyone seemed to know. A temple scribe quietly changed the final line of a public inscription, replacing a name with a symbol. It wasn't defiance. It was refusal. Refusal to forget what mattered. Lucius now spent many mornings by the old ruins of the Curia, where the Senate once bellowed its proclamations into the marble air. Few senators came anymore. The new politics of Rome had turned quieter. Messier, slower, but deeper, like a river disappearing underground, only to resurface stronger elsewhere. One afternoon, a young woman approached him while he sat under the portico. She looked nervous, clutching a bundle of parchment in her arms. "They told me you might read this," she said softly. Lucius took the pages. No titles, no names, just a narrative, vivid, emotional, unadorned. A birth in the hills, a death in the Tiber, a name that echoed across 3 generations but never appeared in any census. He looked up at her. "Is this your family's story?" She nodded. "It's never been written before. Not anywhere." Lucius placed a hand on the parchment. "It has now." She smiled. Not pride, not relief. Something gentler. Recognition. Then she left, not needing anything more from him. Later, Lucius took the pages to the old archive chamber beneath the city. It had grown, not in space, but in feel. The walls, once bare, now held hundreds of carvings, small, soft, layered. Stories told not for power, but for presence. He placed the pages gently on a flat stone altar in the center. The room responded, with the faintest glow, like memory saying thank you. As he left the chamber, he noticed a new phrase etched into the exit wall. Not in Latin, not Greek, something older, but its meaning was clear. The flame remembers. That evening, as Lucius crossed the forum, a child ran past him holding a kite made of parchment. It caught the wind, soaring high above the city. Painted on its face, the downward flame. Beneath it, a simple spiral. No one chased the child. No soldier tore the kite down. People only watched. And maybe, just maybe, they understood. In this quiet way, Rome was being rewritten, not by decree, but by memory. And the archive, once hidden in shadows, was now in the air itself. Carried like smoke, or breath. The first cold night of the season arrived without warning. A hush fell over the city as the wind turned sharp, rattling shutters and curling beneath cloaks. The sky cleared of its summer haze, revealing a blanket of stars so dense and low it felt as though Rome had been roofed by memory. Lucius wrapped himself in a wool cloak and lit a small fire in the hearth of his modest room. Not grand, not hidden, just enough space for a mat, a basin, and a shelf of marked stones. He stared into the flames and thought of her again, the girl with the moonlit eyes. Not a vision anymore, not a dream, but a thread, winding through people, moments, memories. She had become a symbol, not of resistance, but of return. The next morning, Lucius walked to the edge of the Aventine Hill. From there, he could see the city stretched out beneath the rising sun, still laced in mist. He wasn't alone. An older man stood near the ledge, hands clasped behind his back. Lucius recognized him. Senator Gallus, once a fierce supporter of Domitian, now a man whose influence had slipped quietly out of favor. Strange thing, Gallus said without turning. Power. You spend your life climbing toward it, only to realize the higher you go, the less you see. Lucius stepped beside him. It blinds more than it illuminates. Gallus finally looked at him. His eyes weren't cold, just tired. You're the one who started all this, aren't you? Lucius gave a faint smile. I didn't start anything. I just remembered out loud. Gallus nodded slowly. It's spreading. The stories, the songs. Even my grandchildren speak them now, as if they've always known. They have, Lucius said quietly. The memory was never gone, just buried. Gallus let out a breath that was almost a laugh. So what now? Lucius looked over the rooftops, where plumes of chimney smoke curled like unwritten verses. We let it grow, he said, without owning it, without naming it, like roots under stone. That evening, a strange thing happened. Across several neighborhoods in Rome, in Subura, on Palatine, even along the Tiber's muddy banks, small gatherings formed. Not arranged, not organized, just neighbors, sitting together, lighting fires, telling stories, not about emperors or wars, but about lost sisters, old dreams, things they thought no one else had felt. And as each tale ended, someone, sometimes a child, sometimes a grandmother, would draw a symbol into the dirt. Not taught, just remembered. By the end of that week, the city's walls bore hundreds of faint marks. Some cleaned away by officials, others painted over. But every time one disappeared, 3 more would appear. Not vandalism, not protest, just presence. Lucius returned to the old archive again. He brought no scroll, no relic, only a bowl of water and a single olive branch. He placed it in the center, not as offering, but as invitation, to anyone who might find it, to anyone who might remember. Because memory, once awakened, does not sleep again. It only waits. And on that cold night, Rome dreamed of itself. Not as it was, but as it had always wanted to be. Warm, listening, alive. The first frost came gently, not with storms or warning, but with the quiet touch of silver on rooftops. Rome woke slower that morning, its breath visible in the dawn air, its usual noise muffled beneath the weight of stillness. Lucius walked the streets before sunrise, his sandals crunching over a thin layer of ice. The city smelled of smoke and sleep, of 1,000 small hearths lit in the early dark. And though no bells rang, no announcements were made, something had shifted. The archive was no longer hidden beneath Rome. It was Rome. In a bakery near the Janiculum Hill, an apprentice placed a tiny carved flame on the counter next to each loaf of bread. When her master scolded her, she only replied, They're not for sale. They're reminders. In a bathhouse, graffiti began appearing on the steam-soaked walls. Not obscene slogans or political jabs, but questions. What did your grandmother forget? When did you last remember something that made no sense, but felt true? People began answering them, quietly, with chalk, or simply in conversation. Lucius met Talia again beneath the arches of the old aqueduct. Her eyes were tired, but alight. They tried to erase it, she said, brushing frost from bench. The symbols, the stories, even the girl. Lucius sat beside her, and they failed. A silence settled between them, not heavy, but full, like snowfall just beginning. Some say the girl's real, Talia whispered, that she walks the streets at night, just appearing, not speaking, just watching. Lucius closed his eyes. She's not real, he murmured. Talia turned to him. She's memory. That evening, Lucius was invited to a gathering. Not a performance, not a ritual. Just a few dozen people in a garden courtyard, wrapped in blankets, sipping warm wine. They called it the circle. No one led. No one taught. They simply passed a small stone bowl from hand to hand. Whoever held it could speak. A memory, a dream, a story no one else would believe. A farmer spoke of hearing voices in the fields, whispering the names of long-forgotten grains. A widow described a recurring vision of a staircase beneath her floorboards, though she'd never seen it in waking life. A child whispered that her toy doll had begun humming a tune she'd never learned. No one laughed. No one doubted, because everyone had a story like that now. Lucius took the bowl last. He held it in his lap and spoke softly. I once believed the archive was something we had to protect, but I was wrong. He looked up at the firelight dancing across the faces around him. It was never ours. It never needed guards. It only needed space. A little silence. A little listening. Someone near the back murmured, "And now?" Lucius smiled gently. Now, it remembers us too. Later that night, walking home through quiet alleys, Lucius paused before a blank wall. Something tugged at him. He dipped his finger into a puddle of melted frost and drew the flame. But this time, he added something new. Two hands, open, not grasping. Below them, a single word, remain. And far above, where stars watched without judgment, the girl, or whatever she was, stood on a rooftop. Not smiling, not frowning, just there, like memory, like truth, like a candle that doesn't burn out, only waits to be seen. Winter deepened. Rome's skies hung low and pale, and the streets echoed with a hush of bundled footsteps. Fires crackled in doorways and courtyards, not just for warmth, but for comfort, as if the city itself were gathering close to something old, something sacred. The archive was no longer a whisper. It had become a rhythm. It lived in lullabies hummed by vendors while folding linen, in the way a senator paused mid-speech, as if remembering an older version of truth. In children's games that involved closing their eyes, placing a hand to the ground, and listening for what they didn't say. Lucius walked less now. He didn't need to. Others were carrying the story forward. He spent most days in a small room near the southern wall. Not a temple, not a school. Just a room. People came without being summoned. They brought small offerings, not of wealth or sacrifice, but of memory. A mother laid down a string of beads, each one carved with a name her family hadn't spoken in generations. An old sailor placed a map he'd drawn from dreams, a coastline that didn't match any known shore. A young girl, no more than 7, handed Lucius a small figurine molded from wax, a flame on its head. No face. Lucius asked, "Where did you learn to make this?" She shrugged. "I didn't learn. I remembered." On a cold afternoon, a man arrived in heavy robes, his hands stained with ink. He was a scribe from the Imperial Archives, the official ones. The ones that had once tried to erase the silent war from every record. "I've been watching," he said, "for months." Lucius nodded, and the man pulled something from his satchel. A scroll, but not one written by decree. It was handwritten, personal. Inside, a full list of names. People who had vanished over the past 30 years. Disappeared without trial, without burial. Some I knew, the scribe whispered. Some I loved. He placed the scroll before Lucius, then bowed. not out of submission, but reverence. I don't need them to be remembered by history, he said, just by someone. Lucius reached for the scroll. You're someone. That night, Lucius sat by his fire and read the names aloud, each one like a bell in the cold. Each one returned to the air. He did not weep, not aloud, but the room around him warmed, as if the archive itself, no longer hidden, no longer afraid, was drawing breath with him. A few days later, a girl knocked at his door. Not the same as before. Older, wiser. She didn't speak, only handed him a folded cloth. Inside, a new symbol. The flame still burned. The spiral still turned. But now a river ran through them both. Flowing forward, Lucius asked softly, "What do you call it?" She smiled. "Continuum." And in that moment, Lucius understood. The war had never been about memory versus power. It had been about interruption. The Empire had tried to stop the river. But rivers don't end when they're blocked. They rise. They find another path. The first snowfall came with no warning. It arrived not with fanfare, but with hush, flakes drifting through the early morning like lost pages from unwritten books. The rooftops turned white in silence. The city held its breath. Lucius watched it fall from the steps of the old grain house, wrapped in a wool cloak stitched with threadbare spirals. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The world around him was already telling the story. Everywhere, the archive was becoming, not in fire or fury, but in texture, in a way things felt. There was a new weight to objects people once considered ordinary. A bowl carried the memory of a grandmother's song. A doorway, scratched with faint lines, whispered the names of those who had passed through it long ago. Even shadows seemed to hold something more, not darkness but depth. In a bakery near the Palatine, a woman handed Lucius a loaf stamped with a flame and said, "My mother told me stories like yours. Before the wars. Before everything." He took the bread in both hands. "Then it's not my story at all," he replied. She smiled. "No, it's ours." Tullia visited again, wrapped in scarves, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She sat beside him beneath the portico and handed him a scrap of parchment. "It's spreading farther than we thought," she whispered. The parchment was a map, not one made for soldiers or tax collectors, but for rememberers. Small marks dotted the empire: Ephesus, Alexandria, Lugdunum, Carthago Nova, each one bearing a different version of the symbol. Spirals curled like seashells, flames nested in tree roots, stars embedded within water lines. "They're adapting it," Tullia said. "Not copying, living it." Lucius traced a fingertip across the parchment, from west to east. They were always ready. They were just waiting for a moment. He thought often of the girl now, not with sadness, but with rhythm, as if she had become a note woven into everything. Sometimes he swore he saw her reflection in water or caught a flicker of her shape in the corner of candlelight. She never spoke. She didn't need to. Her silence said, "I'm here. Keep going." One evening, Lucius returned to the archive beneath the forum. He hadn't planned to, but his feet led him there. The chamber had changed again. It now held nothing new, but somehow it held more. The walls felt alive, breathing, listening. On the far side of the chamber, a small niche glowed faintly. Inside, a circle of flat stones, placed by dozens of hands over months or years. He stepped closer. Each stone bore one word, not in Latin, not in any language he could name, but he understood them. They were feelings, moments, promises. He knelt, touched the center stone. It was warm, and in that warmth, a voice, not spoken, not heard, pulsed through him like heartbeat. Memory isn't just what was. It's what wants to be known. Lucius closed his eyes and whispered, "I know now." He wasn't a guardian. He wasn't a messenger. He was a flame in the wind, and memory had simply chosen him, for a time, to carry its light. Outside, the snow kept falling, but the cold didn't bite anymore. The city had learned to kindle itself from within. The final days of a year arrived quietly, as though the calendar itself were tiptoeing toward the threshold. Fires burned lower, meals grew simpler, and even the laughter in Rome's streets seemed softer, like echoes wrapped in wool. Lucius spent his mornings now in silence, not as retreat, but as reverence. He woke before the bells, lit a single candle, and sat by the window while the city dreamed beneath its blanket of frost. He had no agenda, no plan, only presence. One afternoon, a boy appeared at his door with a satchel of folded parchment. The boy didn't speak, only placed the bundle gently in Lucius's hands and waited. Inside, a collection of symbols, dozens of them, each drawn by a different hand. Some careful, others rushed. Some ornate, others childlike. But all true. Lucius spread them across the table. He recognized none of them, and all of them. Spirals shaped like raindrops. Flames with wings. A new symbol, one he had never seen before. An open door with a shadow walking through it. He looked up at the boy. Where did these come from? The boy simply said, everywhere. Later that night, Lucius walked alone through the city. The snow had begun to melt in narrow streams, revealing soil, stone, and forgotten steps. But as he turned a corner near the edge of the Aventine, he stopped short. A wall stood before him, newly built, still rough from mortar. And on it, hundreds of symbols, painted, carved, pressed into clay and affixed with care. No pattern, no order, just memory. Not claimed, not explained, offered. Lucius ran his fingers over them. Here, a flame with stars inside. There, a spiral with a sleeping face in its center. And above it all, someone had written, in bold, uneven Latin, "This is not a temple. This is a remembering." A woman approached from the shadows. She looked familiar, not in name or face, but in feeling. She held something out to him, a small vial, filled with river water and a sliver of wax. "It's yours," she said, "from when they sent you away." Lucius took it, the weight small but immense. He looked at her. "Why now?" She shrugged, but her voice was steady. "Because it's time." The following morning, the sun rose clear. No fog, no smoke, no sado, just light. Lucius stood on the hill above the forum, alone, watching, but not alone in feeling. He knew now that across the empire, across fields, across coasts, across hearts, others were doing the same. Not watching the sun, but witnessing the memory and letting it walk forward. That evening, he sat by the fire, the vial in his palm, and whispered, "You're not a story. You're a doorway, and I have walked through." He placed the vial on the table, beside the scrolls, beside the stones. He didn't need it anymore. The archive wasn't a place now. It was a presence, and it was everywhere. The days grew short, not bleak, just quieter, like the world was drawing a curtain over the stage, preparing for something unseen. Rome moved slower now. People spoke in lower tones, their footsteps softer, as though not wanting to wake something sleeping beneath the stone. Lucius felt it too, the hush before something ends, or begins again. He no longer needed to walk the city to see the archive's pulse. He could feel it, in the stillness between words, in the pause before a candle was lit, in the way strangers glanced at each other and nodded, even when they didn't know why. They remembered, not everything, but enough. In the forum, where once senators argued beneath columns, children now gathered to draw. They didn't call it play. They didn't ask permission. They simply found stone and began to mark it with soot, clay, and colored thread. Lucius passed them one morning and paused. A girl, perhaps 6 years old, looked up at him and said, "I saw you in my dream. You were walking through a library that didn't have books." Lucius knelt beside her, smiling. What did it have? She blinked, thought, then whispered, "Whispers." He nodded. That's how it remembers now. At sunset, a procession wound through the back alleys near the river. Not official, not announced. Just people carrying small bowls of light. Oil lamps, candles, coals and fire-safe pots. They placed them along the bridges, on doorsteps, beneath arches. No speeches, no songs, only presence. And as night deepened, the city shimmered, not with grandeur, but memory. Like stars had come to rest on the streets. Lucius watched from a rooftop. He didn't join. He didn't need to. It was never about him. It never had been. Later that night, Talia arrived at his door, holding a sealed scroll. "I think it's the last one," she said. Lucius took it with care. The seal wasn't imperial. It was made of wax and ash, pressed with a new symbol. a spiral, a flame, and an eye. Not watching, not judging, witnessing. Inside, the scroll bore no names. No dates. Only a single phrase, written in 3 languages. To be remembered is to remain. Lucius read it once, then again, slower. He didn't speak. He placed the scroll beside the others. That night, he dreamed, not of fire, but of roots, twisting, reaching, gentle, not breaking through the stone but growing around it, patient, eternal, and in the middle of the roots, a small light, not flame, warmth. When he woke, he found a line scratched into the wood of his table. Not his handwriting, not Tullius, but familiar all the same. You've done enough. Let it carry itself now. Lucius stood by the fire, letting the last coals fade. He didn't need to tend it anymore. The warmth would remain, because now they all carried it. The frost stayed longer now, clinging to rooftops like memory itself. Even the Tiber moved more slowly, as if reluctant to leave behind what it'd seen. Lucius rarely left his room these days. Not from weariness, but completion. There were no more scrolls to collect, no more symbols to chase. The archive had outgrown him, and he welcomed it. Now he listened. That's all. He listened to the knock of a broom on stone outside, tapping in quiet rhythm. The same rhythm he once heard in a chant far beneath the Senate steps. He listened to 2 neighbors arguing gently over a forgotten name, laughing when neither could agree on the exact spelling. He listened to children humming unfamiliar tunes that somehow made the air feel familiar. Rome had stopped asking what happened. It had begun asking what mattered. Tullia came one last time, with a wrapped bundle beneath her cloak. A gift, she said, smiling. Not for you. For after. Lucius opened it carefully. Inside, a cloth journal. Hand-stitched. Empty. No title. No instructions. Just pages. He traced a finger over the cover. It should never be closed, he said. She nodded. Then don't bind it. They didn't say goodbye. They never needed to. Later that evening, Lucius walked the quiet streets. He didn't carry a torch, but the city was lit, doorways glowing, windows flickering, alleyways warmed with fire bowls and lanterns tucked into alcoves. Each flame was small. Each flame belonged to someone. He paused by a wall where years ago no one dared to draw. Now it was a mosaic. Spirals, flames, eyes, waves, hands, symbols layered like seasons. He placed his palm flat against the stone, and for a moment, it felt warm beneath his hand. Alive. At midnight, he returned to his room. He sat beside the fire, the final one he would tend. He didn't need to write anything down. Not anymore. Every word had already been spoken, in stories, in silence, in the breath between 2 people who simply chose to remember together. He watched the last log curl into ash, orange to gold, gold to ember, ember to nothing. And then, in a soft whisper to no one in particular, he said, memory never needed saving. It only needed to be seen. The coals dimmed. He closed his eyes, not in sleep, in peace. Outside, the wind carried a sound, faint and fleeting. A voice, familiar and distant, like a whisper wrapped in candlelight. Thank you. And far away, on a rooftop shrouded in mist, the girl stood once more. Not as a ghost, not as a dream, but as continuance, a symbol alive, watching as Rome turned gently toward morning. The final days of winter brought no storms, no drama, only stillness. The kind of deep, settled quiet that comes not from emptiness, but from fullness, completion. Rome didn't feel conquered anymore, or victorious. It felt aware, as if the city had stopped trying to explain itself, and instead began to listen to itself. The walls had learned to echo the right names. The stones had learned to remember the right steps. And the people, perhaps most miraculously, had learned to stop waiting for permission to feel what had always been there. Tullia sat alone by the riverbank now, where once Lucius had waited, uncertain, unsure. She lit a small lamp and let it drift into the current, a slow-moving spark among the dark waters. She didn't speak. The flame was the message. All around her, others had begun doing the same. One by one, across the banks of the Tiber, lamps were released, not as tribute, not as ritual, just as memory let go. Not forgotten, but no longer clutched. Carried forward. In the hills beyond the city, a boy dug up an old urn with an unfamiliar mark. He didn't know what it meant, but he placed it in the center of his family's hearth. That night, his grandmother dreamed of a name she had forgotten for decades. She awoke crying, not in sorrow but relief. In a villa in distant Gaul, a teacher replaced the first sentence of a history lesson, not with a date or emperor's name, but with a question. What stories are missing from this room? In a forgotten alley, someone left a poem scratched into the soot-black wall. We buried it deep and called it silence. But it grew and called us back. No signature, none needed. Everyone knew whose voice it was. The archive no longer lived in hidden chambers. It had become portable, carried in the heart, on the breath, beneath the skin. It no longer belonged to Rome. It belonged to those who listened, to those who remembered the girl in the shadows, to those who saw a spiral in a puddle and paused to wonder why, to those who whispered stories in his sleeping ears, knowing that, even if no one replied, the memory would keep listening. At the edge of a city, where the ruins of an old gate opened to the wild beyond, a stone had been placed upright. It bore no name, only one thing carved deep into its surface. Fire. Nothing more, nothing less. The wind passed over it softly, as though reading aloud. And then it continued on, carrying the story, now untethered, into whatever came next. Outside, the night is still. The last embers of winter cling to the rooftops, and the air hums with a hush, not from fear, but from rest. You can almost hear it, can't you? The soft breath of a city no longer trying to be eternal, only true. And beneath that quiet sky, the archive sleeps, not in hiding, but in peace, not in scrolls or stone, but in the gentle spaces between memory and dream. Somewhere, a child drifts to sleep holding a carved wooden spiral in her palm. She doesn't know its meaning. Not yet, but it warms her hand like a secret waiting to become a story. Somewhere else, a tired scholar forgets to finish a sentence. And that's all right. The silence completes it. And somewhere, far away from marble and firelight, a new archive is beginning. Not copied, but born. Because memory is a living thing. It doesn't follow borders. It flows like breath between those who dare to feel deeply and those who dare to remember what others forgot. The girl in the shadows? She's no longer alone. She's become many. A smile across a firelit face. A hand that draws symbols in dust. A voice that says, wait, that's not how it really happened. She walks now in the spaces between, not haunting, not preaching, just being. Like flame, like spiral, like sleep. So here we are. The fire is low. The story told. The room around you softens, edges blurred by candlelight. The night has settled its weight across your shoulders like a warm shawl. You don't need to move. You don't need to speak. You've listened. That's enough. And as the final whisper of the archive curls into silence, it leaves you with this. You were always part of it, even before you heard the first word. Now, turn off the lights. Let the last ember glow. Let the wind hum its quiet lullaby. Let yourself drift, gently, slowly, into that wide, remembering dark. You're safe. You're warm. You're home. Good night. Crescent moon.